This building and our property is truly an ongoing project. But the thing I love about it is the fact that we get to use it in such special ways by using the farm, by this space during the week is filled with kids from a school, a Montessori school that meets here. There's different churches that meet here on Sunday afternoons and Saturdays. And it's just incredible for us to be able to steward this resource that I feel like is just, it's a blessing for us to have. And so thank you, Ginger, for sharing with us some of the things that are going on and also some of the challenges it is to maintain for a community our size to maintain a space like this. So thank all of you for your ongoing commitment to our church and to making this possible. Well, this morning we are continuing our series called The Shape of Christmas. And in this series, we're really using the imagery of shapes to explore the meaning of the Christmas story. And this morning, we're looking at the shape of the heart, a symbol that we are probably all, that we are all, I won't even say probably, that we are all familiar with. Now, in the first week of this series, Ruth explored the shape of a circle. And among other things, she reminded us, and this is one of the things that stood out to me, that time is both linear and circular. And as a result, even though we hear the Christmas story year after year, it might impact us differently because whether we admit it or not, we are a little bit older and our life circumstances have probably changed a little bit from the previous year too. Now, last week, Matthew looked at the shape of a line, and at first he pondered whether a line is even a shape. But then he helped us see how many of the stories, the Christmas stories in Scripture, function as thresholds, almost as lines that we cross into a society where all people are valued and have supreme worth, not just the people that our culture tends to assign value to, but all people are valued in God's economy. We all are equally valued. If you missed either one of those two messages, you can check them out as always on our website, and they're also on our YouTube channel. I watch a lot of YouTube, so that's where I watch just about everything. That's my moment of transparency. I watch too much YouTube. The shape we're looking at this morning is the heart, which is the universal symbol of love. Now, in the English language, love is a complex word. Now, I came across an article on the English learning or the language learning site called Babbel. They have a blog. I actually used Babbel once to try to learn Spanish. It's hard to learn a language as an adult, but I'm still committing myself to working at it. But I came across an article on the English learning or the language learning site Babbel that said, in the English language, love is a catch-all term for many different kinds of feelings. And then they said this is partly why English speakers are so comfortable slinging love around. Isn't that true? We apply the word love to a range of situations and feelings. I mean, I loved my first car. It was a truck, a Chevy S10. They don't even make them anymore. It's a classic now. Back then, I was obsessed with cars. They were my life. I even worked part-time as an auto mechanic at a Saturn dealership. Remember Saturns? They don't make those anymore either. It wasn't the most glamorous job, but I would have done anything at that point to have the opportunity to work on a vehicle. And oh man, my friends made fun of me. I loved my truck. And I remember the first time I tasted General Tso's chicken from Jade Garden on Washington Road back in Atlanta where I grew up. Man, some people love that chicken from Popeyes. I loved Jade Garden's General Tso chicken. I remember sad day in history when Jade Garden burned down and the owners decided not to rebuild. I was devastated. I love that. But I don't know if you've ever had a restaurant like that, but I loved that chicken. I love my mom. I talk to her every Sunday. It's a privilege to talk to my mom. And I am a mama's boy. I will admit it. Still feels strange to be so far away from home. And we're not really a lovey-dovey family. We don't really talk about emotions or any of those kinds of things. But I do conclude every conversation I have with my mom every Sunday afternoon with the words, I love you. It's just an honor to be able to do that. You know, when I first started dating Kim, my wife, I fell so deeply in love. I couldn't even think straight. Love is not a rational emotion. I'm sure some of us in this room are very familiar with that. It can make you do some crazy things. And I remember one of the first times I told Kim that I loved her, and she looked at me and said, how do you know you love me? And I'm thinking in my head, that's not the way this conversation is supposed to go. And I'm sure I said something like, I just feel it. It's just a feeling I can't describe. And she was not satisfied with that response at all. She wasn't interested in that feeling kind of love. She knew that that feeling kind of love, that it wears out. She wanted a commitment, a promise that I would make the intentional decision to love her through thick and thin, no matter what the situation seemed like. And you know, they say girls mature faster than guys do. And I guess that's true because all I knew is what I felt. And so don't tell her. I said what I needed to say to get to the next date. Now, I hope I matured. You'll have to ask her about that. But love can describe all of these feelings. I can love my truck. I can love General Tso's chicken from Jade Garden. I can love my mom. I can love my wife. These are all separate and distinct feelings, but in the English language, love is the best word we have to describe them. In some ways, love is really a powerful and a flexible emotion, fitting a variety of different situations. Now, in the Greek language, the original language of the Christian scriptures, the original language that the Christian scriptures are written in, the concept of love is a little bit more linguistically nuanced. There's a word for brotherly love. There's a separate word for familial love. There's a word for romantic love. And there's a word for what's often referred to as unconditional love. Now, unconditional love is a powerful kind of love. It's not based on the quality of the relationship. It's not transactional in that way. It transcends emotions and feelings. It outlasts the test of time. This kind of love keeps loving even when it's unnoticed, unappreciated, and even when it's rejected. And this is the word the Bible uses to describe the kind of love that God has for the world, the whole world. God loves without conditions. That means you are fully loved. You are fully accepted, that you are fully embraced by the God of creation, just like you are, just as you are. And that is, my friends, good news. You can't earn God's love. You can't lose God's love. You can't obtain more of it because God has no more of it to give. You have all of it. God's love is full and complete, regardless of what you say, think, or do. In fact, in 1 John 4, verse 8, John, an early disciple of Jesus, writes that God is love. Look at 1 John 4 and verse 8. It says, whoever does not love does not know God because God is love. Now, in this verse, John seems to have this idea that love is not something that God does, but it's the very essence of God. To know God is to know love in its purest form. And the love of God is so powerful. And this is what I think John is grappling with here in this verse, that the love of God is so powerful that when we encounter it, it changes us. That's what John is getting at when he says, whoever does not love does not know God. For John, we are more than just recipients of God's love. We are transformed into conduits through which God's love flows through us to the world. Now, maybe you've been made to think something different about God. Or maybe you've been made to feel like God's love is reserved for a certain kind of person. Or maybe your view of love has been influenced by human relationships where love is so often conditional and transactional and can feel a little bit frail. Or for one reason or another, you feel like you do not deserve God's love. I really want you to hear me this morning that God's love is not that kind of love. God loves you as you are. And there's nothing you can do about that. There's nothing you can do to lose it. There's nothing you can do to stop God from loving you. That's just who God is. 1 John 4 verse 8 says, whoever does not love does not know God because God is love. It's a powerful, unconditional kind of love. Now, the last time I spoke, we were wrapping up that series through the book of Colossians. And I made kind of a passing comment about my favorite book of the Bible being the Gospel of John, which was likely written by the same author as 1 John, where the verse that we just read comes from. And I was surprised to learn that some of you do not like the Gospel of John as much as I do. In fact, there are a couple of you that had some pretty strong arguments about why I shouldn't like the Gospel of John as much as I do. And so I see that we have some work to do to show you that the Gospel of John is, in fact, the best of the four Gospels and quite possibly the best book in all of the Christian scriptures. I'm only sort of kidding. Now, this morning, we're going to look at the Gospel of John, and we're going to look at how John talks about the birth of Jesus. Now, if you're familiar with John's Gospel, you know that it does not begin with your typical birth story. There's no genealogy preceding the birth of Jesus. There's no virgin birth. There aren't any fanciful stories of magi following a low-hanging star to the place where baby Jesus was lying. There's no shepherds in the field keeping watch over their flocks at night. There's no 8-pound, 6-ounce newborn infant Jesus lying in a manger. Some might not even consider it a Christmas story. But in my opinion, this shouldn't surprise you, it is the best Christmas story. And those historical details just don't seem to matter to the story that John is telling, because John wants us to see the cosmic significance of Jesus' birth. And this becomes clear from the very beginning of John's gospel. Let's look at John, at least first 14 verses of John, just to get a feel for how John talks about Jesus' birth, or more accurately, how John talks about the arrival of Jesus. Now, for the sake of time, we're not going to read straight through these verses and then come back and talk about them. I'm going to read a little bit and talk a little bit, read a little bit and talk a little bit. We're going to work our way through John chapter 1 in these first 14 verses in John chapter 1. All right, so John chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him, all things were made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. Now, this passage, it takes us back to the beginning. And not just the start of the Christmas story, but the beginning of creation itself. John is intentionally using the language of Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created. That's what it says in Genesis 1:1. And then the term word that John is using feels a little bit strange and difficult to understand. And in fact, we could talk about it for a long time. But let me just say that this word that John uses here is the Greek word logos, which is a concept with rich philosophical roots. Now, in Greek philosophy, logos refers to the rational principle that orders the universe. And later in this chapter, we're going to see that for John, the logos, the rational principle that orders the universe, the word as it is in our English translation, the one who ordered chaos into creation, John's going to tell us that that one is Jesus. And John seems to be signaling that this is not an ordinary birth story. God, in some mysterious way, is stepping into the world that God created. And therefore, the life Jesus brings isn't just physical, it's spiritual. And it makes unconquerable light, love, hope, and joy available to all creation. Look at what it says in verse 5. I think this is the last verse that's on the screen. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. You see, John wants us to see that Jesus coming into the world is like light piercing through the darkness. And that's why our tradition of gathering on Christmas Eve after the sun goes down and darkness has settled over the earth and lighting candles is such a powerful tradition. The flickers of light that light up this room remind us that light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And here's the powerful truth. The darkness cannot, will not overcome the light. In the deepest struggles, the darkest nights, and the moments when all hope feels lost, the light of Christ continues to shine in us and through us. You see, Christmas isn't just a season of lights. It's a declaration that the presence of Jesus has already overcome the darkness that is in this world. Now, if we continue reading in verse 6, we see John says, there was a man sent from God whose name was John. Now, that's not the John that's writing this gospel, by the way. I think John was a fairly common name. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning the light so that through him all might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. Now, this John that's referred to here is John the Baptist, whose role was to point people to the light. And in some ways, that's our role as well. We are not the light. We are not the source of hope. We are rather witnesses to it. The true light, the source, the one who gives light, who offers genuine hope to everyone is Jesus. And so Christmas becomes a reminder that God's light is available to all, that no one is left out. Verse 9 says, true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. And then in verse 10, he says, he was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet, to all who did receive him, to those who believe in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. You see, Jesus came to the world that he created, and that world did not recognize him, and that even though he created it, it did not understand who he was. The love, light, the hope that Jesus offered, it was in fact rejected by many. But those who did receive him, those who did believe, are given a new identity. We become children of God, not because of who we are or because of what we've done, but because of God's open invitation to join God's own family. You see, Christmas is an invitation to join the family of God and be about the same work, sharing love and light and hope and joy with the world, the same work that Jesus was about. And then the final verse, and I always want to just skip ahead to this verse, but the final verse of this section, John chapter 1, verse 14, it says, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." Now, this right here is the heart of the Christmas story. God became one of us. The eternal Word put on human flesh and made his dwelling among us. Now, in the Message version of the Bible, you probably heard someone reference this before, but John 1, verse 14 puts it in a way that illustrates it powerfully. It says, "The Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. We saw the glory with our own eyes, the one of a kind glory, like Father, like Son, generous inside and out, true from start to finish. The Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood." You see, John is reminding us that God is not distant, watching from afar. God has chosen to live with us, to share in our human experience. And Christmas is not just about God with us, but because God is love, it's about love being with us. Christmas shows us that love is not distant, it's not abstract, it's embodied and present. God came near, and that changes everything. Now, the theological word that's often used, often associated with this concept of God coming near, becoming human, taking on flesh, is incarnation. It literally means in the flesh. The incarnation is the moment when God became flesh in Jesus, and it stands as one of the most powerful mysteries and transformative realities of the Christian faith. It reveals that in Jesus, divinity and humanity are perfectly united. And this act of divine humility demonstrates to us God's deep desire to connect with us, not as a distant observer, but as one who fully understands the human experience. You see, Jesus didn't just take on human form. He embraced the fullness of human experience, along with all of its joys, sorrows, suffering, and the struggle to remain hopeful in the midst of dark and difficult times. This means that in every aspect of our lives, from our greatest joys to our deepest sorrows, God is present with us. Love is present with us. The incarnation assures us that God is not far or unconcerned with what's happening here, but he's intimately involved in the fabric of our daily lives. The incarnation does not just reveal God's solidarity with the human experience, but it also bridges the gap between heaven and earth. In Jesus, the divine enters the human story, bringing healing and hope, justice and equity, restoration and reconciliation. And this union of humanity and divinity means that God's love is not abstract or theoretical, it's tangible and accessible. It shows us the true nature of God's love, a love that's willing to come close, to dwell among us, and to sacrifice for our sake. You see, the incarnation elevates our understanding of what it means to be human. By taking on human flesh, Jesus dignifies our humanity, reminding us that our daily lives matter to God. In Christ, we see humanity's full potential realized, and we're invited to participate in the divine life through him. And John is really driving this point home in John chapter 1, in the first 14 verses of that chapter. However, I've always bought into the idea that that all the books of the Bible weren't intended to be broken into chapters and verses and read in bits and pieces. And I've always kind of believed, at least as from the time I heard it, this theory, this idea that John's gospel was originally a sermon that was written by John and was intended to be read as a whole to a congregation that sat and listened to it. So this morning, we're just going to start over in John chapter, not just joking. We aren't going to read the entire gospel this morning. But I do think we have to be careful not to disconnect what happens in John chapter 1 from the rest of the story that John tells. Because in the rest of the story, John is connecting the Christmas story, the arrival, the birth of Jesus, to what Jesus did, and showing us that God doesn't just love a particular people, although Jesus lived in a particular time, in a particular community. God doesn't just love a particular people, but God's love is God's love for us, for the whole world. And John makes this point in a verse that is arguably the most popular verse in the Bible. And that's because it's in the most popular book in the Bible. John 3:16, for God so loved the world that God gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. This verse comes almost like a clarifying comment in John's gospel. John is making it clear that what God is doing through Jesus has no borders or boundaries. He may have moved into the neighborhood, but his love extends far beyond it. You see, the Christmas story reveals to us what love looks like in action, a love that enters our brokenness, bears our burdens, and brings us back to life. This isn't a love that saves us from this world. It's a love that empowers us to live fully in it. It's not just a love that Jesus spoke about. Jesus didn't just say, I love the world, but rather he showed his love for the world. He demonstrated it through changed lives and changed situations, the way he entered people's stories. You know, I think about the story of the wedding at Cana in John chapter 2. And I've always thought this was a peculiar story to be in the Bible. You know, when the host ran out of wine at the wedding banquet, Jesus didn't just shrug his shoulders and walk off and say, that stinks for them. Like that's someone else's problem. Rather, he stepped in and provided for their need, turning water into wine, meeting a very practical, basic, maybe some would say unnecessary, some might say unnecessary need, but saving this family from shame. In John chapter 4, we see Jesus sitting at a well with a Samaritan woman, a woman that most people would have either ignored or condemned. But Jesus didn't just see her, he engaged with her. He made space for her. He made time for her. He listened to her story. He affirmed her life. And in John chapter 11, when Jesus' friend Lazarus dies, Jesus didn't hide his emotions. He wept with Mary and Martha, Lazarus' sisters. Even though Jesus knew that he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead, he felt the pain of their loss at that moment. And what we see over and over again in the Gospel of John and the other Gospels, but over and over again, Jesus' love wasn't just spoken, it was shown. It was healing the sick. It was feeding the hungry. It was washing the feet of his disciples and ultimately laying down his life for what he calls his friends. And friends is another theme in John's gospel. Actually, it's woven throughout this entire book. But in chapter 15, Jesus actually teaches about friendship. And for Jesus, friendship isn't a closed circle, but an open category of people who receive and reciprocate God's love. Look at what Jesus says in John chapter 15. I'm going to start in verse 9. It says, as the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Now remain in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and remain in his love. I have told you this so that my joy may be in you and your joy may be complete. My command is this: love each other as I have loved you. Now, in this section, John records Jesus' teaching about the idea of remaining in his love. He wants us to see that experiencing the fullness of God's love through Jesus is not a passive posture. We're not just recipients, but it's an active relationship. Jesus is saying, stay connected to me. Let my love be the foundation of your life. And then Jesus gives us a purpose for remaining in his love. He says that your joy may be complete. You see, God's love isn't just about endurance. It's about abundance. It's about living in the fullness of joy that comes from knowing that we are loved without condition. But this love isn't something that we keep to ourselves. Jesus teaches us to love one another in the same way he's loved us, fully, sacrificially, unconditionally. And this ties directly to what we've already seen about God's love being with us and for us. And now Jesus is showing us that this love must flow through us. You see, the Christmas story is about God's love flowing through us. Look at this next verse in verse 13. It says, greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. I no longer call you servants, because a servant does not know the master's business. Instead, I've called you friends, for everything I learned from the Father, I've made known to you. You see, Jesus takes love to its deepest level here. He defines the ultimate expression of love as laying down one's life for one's friends, this open category of people who receive and reciprocate God's love. And then he does something extraordinary. He calls us his friends. This is profound because it shifts our relationship with Jesus. We're not merely followers or servants doing his bidding. We're invited into friendship with God. We're invited into friendship with Jesus. To be called a friend of Jesus means being included in the mission and the work that Jesus engaged in the world. It's about sharing the love that flows from the Father, as Jesus says, through the Son to the world. Notice that this isn't just about obedience. There's a relationship here. Jesus says, everything I learned from my Father, I've made known to you. This is God's love revealed, not as a distant commandment, but as an open invitation to participate in the divine work of love. And then let's look at these last two verses as we prepare to wrap up. In verse 16, John writes this, recording Jesus's words, "You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you so that you might go and bear fruit, fruit that will last, and so that whatever you ask in my name, the Father will give you. This is my commandment: love each other." You see, here John is reminding us that love begins with God's initiative. You did not choose me, but I chose you, Jesus says. God's love is not something we earn or even something that we initiate. It's a gift. But that gift comes with a purpose: to bear fruit. And the fruit Jesus is talking about isn't just good deeds or random acts of kindness. It's lasting fruit, the kind of love that transforms reality. You see, Jesus ends this passage with a simple yet profound command: love each other. This love isn't static. It's a love that moves outward, that flows through us to others. This is the shape of Christmas and the heart of our calling: to remain in God's love, to embrace his joy, and to extend his love in tangible, transformative ways to the world that's around us. And this morning, we have opportunity to share in communion, and the band can come on back up. But we also have the Advent candles here that focus our attention during this season. And the last couple of weeks, we have lit candles. In the first week, we lit the candle of hope, a candle that reminds us that even in despair, a very human emotion, even in darkness, when things feel heavy, even when our eyes can't see, that we have real hope in Jesus. And then last week, we lit the candle of peace. One that reminds us that we don't just carry peace with us, but Jesus truly is our peace. And that in following in the way of Jesus, we live in a more peaceful way. That reality around us is transformed. And that people get to experience the peace of God through us. I don't know about you, but that for me feels like a weighty responsibility. And so we focus ourselves on that we get to be people of peace. And then today we light the candle of love, a candle that reminds us of the virtue, the value, the ethic of Jesus. The life of Jesus revolved around love, and that as we follow Jesus, we become more loving people. Now, these attributes, these characteristics, they show up for us, and we focus on them in this Advent season. But they are really at the center, the core of the gospel and who Jesus is. But my joy is this, that during this season, at the end of the year, at a time where people begin to think and reflect on what the new year will bring, we have an opportunity to commit to the kind of people we're going to be and the kind of journey we're going to take as we navigate life in this world that so often feels hopeless, that so often feels disrupted, and that so often lacks unconditional love. And so, in this moment of reflection, there's 3 tables that have juice and gluten-free crackers prepared, the one in the center and then 2 on the side. If you'd like to share in communion, you can make your way to one of these tables. You can spend time in prayer. You can light a candle in the back. You can sit and do nothing if you'd like. But this is a moment for us to reflect as we commit and recommit ourselves to following in the way